Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Curious Apes. And this episode, I am joined by neuroscientist Bobby Azarian, who authored the 2022 book, The Romance of Reality: How the Universe Organizes Itself to Create Life, Consciousness, and Cosmic Complexity. I interviewed Bobby 2 years ago on the Singularity University podcast when this book was first released, where at that time we focused predominantly on how the second law of thermodynamics actually creates complexity as a way to increase entropy, and how life itself, including human beings and how we think, are part of that process. I'll include a link to that episode in the show notes in case you'd like to have a foundational understanding before diving into this one. But I do think that this episode can stand on its own if you do prefer to jump right in. I will say, though, you'll have to kind of accept the premise if the conversation here is going to make sense. But if you want to understand why the premise makes sense, I do suggest you listen to that first episode. In which case, in this episode, you'll find a discussion on how this process of complexification imbues the universe with an increasing self-awareness and meaning, how Bobby believes that this creates an almost spiritual duty for humans to become stewards of the process, how to therefore navigate the process in better or worse ways as our species innovates, and a whole lot more. And so without further ado, I'll go ahead and just jump right into it. Everyone, please welcome to Curious Apes, Bobby Azarian.
For me, with your work, where I want to start is to try to, let's say, come at it in a softer way. Your ideas are big, bold, ambitious, and frankly, I think a bit confusing if you're not really familiar with the concepts in general. Like, there's a lot of interdisciplinary things happening here that require, I think, at least a smattering of expertise in different areas. With that being said, to kind of give us an understanding of your telos for the universe, the kind of this goal or purpose that it's working towards, can you give just maybe like a non-technical layman's overview of the general concepts? And then from there, I think we can kind of find some inroads to dig in and get into more detail.
Yeah, I'll try to, because really the goal here is to make it as simple as possible. I think this provides an opportunity to tell the story of nature in a coherent way with this kind of overarching narrative. And if people understand that narrative, then everything, like all the sciences, kind of, you see how they fit together, and everything kind of clicks. So ultimately, it's a really simple story. It's the story of the universe organizing itself and waking up. So basically, we shouldn't think about the universe as being some static kind of inert thing that life exists in. We should see ourselves as part of an evolving dynamical system, and that this system, that is the universe, is generating complexity over time and emergences. So it's creating new phenomena, and life is a product of this cosmic scale complexification process. So living organisms represent bits of inanimate matter in the universe that have begun to become aware. And so we don't see ourselves as separate from the universe in this paradigm. We're manifestations of the creative tendency of the universe.
Great. And with that, the key word that I think I'd want to lean into there is maybe the complexity part and this kind of awareness or sentience part. So you talk about it, a computational universe that's increasingly complex, moving towards something that's waking up. Maybe we can take those a word at a time. What is computational about the universe? What is the process that is being enacted to start moving us along that trajectory?
Yeah, so Seth Lloyd, quantum physicist at MIT, and he's external professor for the Santa Fe Institute. He wrote a book in the late 90s or early 2000s called Programming the Universe. And basically, this put out this paradigm that was kind of inspired by the physicist John Wheeler, who coined the term black hole, and started this movement called It from Bit, that the universe is something like a giant computer, possibly a quantum computer, and that when the particles in the universe are interacting, there's an exchange of information. So the universe is seen at a fundamental level as this information processing system. But I don't think it's until life emerges that we really get computation in a meaningful sense, because life provides memory for this computer. So life starts encoding information through the evolutionary process, through Darwinian dynamics. It starts storing information from about the environment. It starts mapping relationships between different objects in the environment and between the organism and its environment. So life is basically modeling the world. And so life represents a physical system inside the universe that's part of that universe that's started to map the whole. And now with humans who represent self-aware systems, so nature has started to become aware of itself, and we're becoming aware that we're part of this cosmic process. We've started to map more and more of this universe. So you can close your eyes and you can imagine wherever you are right now. You can imagine what your studio looks like. You can imagine what your neighborhood looks like. You could even generate a mental simulation of the cosmos as a whole. And so from that, exercise, we know that we have this map of the world encoded in our brains. So we represent the universe modeling itself. And through that process, nature starts to become self-aware.
So when we say model in this sense, we would say, using evolution or biology, we would first say something like DNA, RNA. This is a system of information that is kind of tracking the environment by evolving to match it. And that's kind of how we model it with our DNA. And then eventually our minds can do this kind of modeling with synapses and neurons to build mental models. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, you got it right. So it starts off with genetic models, and those models get formed through this trial and error process. Evolution is producing a variety of organisms with random genetic mutations. So it's producing all these different designs, but some of these designs are fit. And when you think about fitness, you have to think about the organism's relationship to its environment. So if something is fit, it's basically well adapted to its ecological niche. So it in some way is a model of that niche. It has a configuration that does well in that environment. So in an abstract way, it encodes information about the environment. So Karl Popper had this philosophy called evolutionary epistemology, and he saw the evolutionary process as a knowledge creation process. And some examples used are fins of a dolphin contain knowledge of hydrodynamics, and wings of a bird contain knowledge of aerodynamics. So you can think about living organisms as representations of the outside world. So in that way, organisms sort of mirror the universe that they inhabit.
Right. And then through the process of natural selection, the things that are more fit become better models of their environment. But kind of along this same thought is this idea of complexification, right? We could say their entities are becoming more complex. We started with these single cell bacteria, and we're moving up until we get to something like a human that's more complex. But what does complex mean in this? If the universe is becoming more complex, is complex a representation of how much information is being processed, how integrated the information is, how accurate the map is, how good we are exploiting energy in our environment? What does complex mean?
Yeah, I'd say all those things. So first of all, I should say not all species are evolving to become more complex. And that's kind of always been the argument against this idea that nature has this tendency towards higher and higher complexity. But that's kind of a straw man argument, because no one who's really seriously arguing for this position is saying that all species become more complex. They become more efficient. They become they start to have more elegant designs. They use energy more efficiently, so they're becoming more better adapted to the niche they inhabit. But because evolution is always creating new forms, so organisms will reproduce and there'll be a genetic mutation that creates a new design. There's always an opportunity for a new design that unlocks a new source of free energy in the environment. So at first we had organisms that lived off the energy coming out of hydrothermal vents, these underwater volcanoes where the origin of life was thought to happen. Then we had photosynthetic life that extracted energy from sunlight to power life. And then later we got animals that eat other animals. So there's always this opportunity for designs of living organisms that could encode more variables in the world, which allow them to unlock new sources of energy. And so this led to an increasingly most complex species. So it's not that everything's getting more complex. You're getting a diversity of structures, and all of those things are component parts in a larger organism, which is the biosphere, and they're each becoming more specialized. So you can look at it that way, but the whole thing in general is becoming more complex because you're getting more species, and the most complex species is becoming more complex. And it's not that it's just becoming more complex. So when you said what is complexity, it's becoming more complex because it can encode more states of the world. So it can encode a larger variety of ways that the universe can surprise it, basically. So it's encoding more solutions to larger repertoire of potential problems. But there's also this recursive, self-reflective aspect to complexity, where it starts to model the world, but it also starts to model itself as an agent in the world, and then it can become aware of its model, and then it can start to adapt its model. So humans can think about their model and whether it's accurate, how accurate it is, what their place is in this process of complexification. We can start to actually design systems that, like AI systems that increase our computational power and allow us to solve more problems. So this isn't just a biological thing. Biological evolution is continuous with cultural evolution in this paradigm. So it's just basically cultural evolution is extending the memory capacity of life on Earth, and it's extending our causal power by giving us more tools, making us more functional, making us have a greater capacity for manipulating the world around us. So we're becoming more complex, I would say, in terms of the number of states in the universe we can respond to, but there's also this hierarchical complexity where there's more levels in the system, and those higher levels allow for richer self-modeling and world modeling capacity.
Do you see a way in which these, I guess, complexification niches could either fully plateau to where there is no chaos to compel something to evolve? Like, is it possible that we would get sufficiently good at just exploiting our environment in such a stable way that we, as maybe humans, aren't the spearhead of complexity in the universe, and we might be like a local minimum or maximum and plateau? Does that seem possible to you?
It's good that life will never find a perfectly stable state, because then it wouldn't progress. It would just, like you said, it would plateau and become stagnant. I can't even imagine that being utopia if there's not any progress or change. So it's kind of good that the world has this tendency towards disorder that's associated with the second law of thermodynamics. So things, dynamical systems will naturally decay and fall apart unless they can extract energy from the environment. For example, we need food and water, but we also extract energy and use fossil fuels to power all of our activities and technology. So energy extraction is the name of the game for life to keep going, and this provides a continual challenge. And basically, this tendency towards disorder in the universe always pushes life to progress and evolve. As far as other life form, I think you mentioned something about like, could something emerge that makes us obsolete? I think you kind of like hinted at something about, you said about if life could plateau. Were you hinting at?
Well, I guess if we weren't the spearhead, right? So like
Yeah.
you were mentioning, as the niches kind of build upon one another, while some might break off into stable niches where they are fully able to exploit that environment, like let's say I think you call them you've called them simple organisms in past conversations. We've continued on, right? That this is kind of the argument people use against evolution, is like, well, if we evolved from monkeys, why are monkeys still here, right?
Yeah.
I guess my point is, could we be the monkeys and then something keeps going on as we plateau?
Were you thinking something biological or something like AI, embodied AI?
I don't see a reason why it couldn't be either, I suppose.
Yeah, so
either.
I think the interesting thing about, and I will say this, there is a plateau always, but there's always another paradigm that life can shift to find a way forward. So civilizations do collapse. It's not that it's this completely inexorable process of linear progression. Progression occurs through these cycles. So the thing about humans, the reason I don't think we'll become obsolete and be replaced by another species is because technology allows us to kind of continuously adapt, and it's not just about us anymore. We start building environments that enhance us. I'm not just talking about like transhumanism enhancement, but just, the infrastructure that like a city has that's pretty much protecting life. So we keep inventing technologies that allows us to map more and more of the world. So rather than something replacing us, and I don't see us as being the next step, and kind of making lower primates obsolete or anything like that. The whole system that is the biosphere exists as this intelligent network, and all of these things are playing different roles in food chains and ecosystems. So if bacteria disappeared tomorrow, we die because we rely on bacteria to do a lot of stuff in our gut, and the microbiome. And if the bees disappear tomorrow, humans would be in big trouble. So I see this as something, life is this holistic phenomenon. It's this network that I've called adaptive complexity. Actually, David Deutsch, the theoretical physicist, used that term before me. But it's a network of complex adaptive systems. And so it's the network that's intelligent. And if humans do create conscious AI, which we don't know if that's possible, I don't believe they'll replace us. I think that's where I thought you might be going. I think it'll just be an extension of this intelligent network that has all these different intelligences. But the most self-aware species is special in a way because it's that leading edge of complexity, and self-awareness does allow the organism to look at its own model and to be able to adapt that. So you can start where evolution is kind of this blind process that does have this intelligence. It's like an unconscious intelligence. And when self-aware agents arise, the intelligence or the evolutionary process can then be directed. So we're at this point in evolution where there's this new emergence, and we can start to basically we become the drivers of this complexification process. But I always wonder, is it, am I thinking, is there some sort of bias that I have where I don't want to believe that AI will be superior to humans, and that they'll kind of just, AI will remain unconscious and kind of just augment our abilities? It's possible that something more superior could emerge, but I hope those things would understand that there's this network intelligence and that basically all these different intelligences solve problems in different ways. And I think the way that we want to preserve, the species in nature, and we learn from those things, that a higher intelligence would appreciate us in the same way.
Yeah. Well, that's one way in which I guess things could go wrong. But I'd say in my more like doomer moments, if there is a place where I sometimes worry or wonder where something might have happened, a paradigm shift might have occurred, it's the fact that we have taken over steering things, right? If this process was blind and in a sense therefore kind of let's say really good at creating harmony, it's almost like intelligent design, right? Like when you use natural selection and evolution, things fit themselves together in a very harmonious way to kind of create these symbiotic ecosystems that you're alluding to. But when you give one organism within that ecosystem consciousness and awareness and language, and you allow it to start altering the environment, well, now it's changing the thing that it's supposed to have a harmony with, right? And I guess my concern is that we aren't very good at designing our own zoos, right? Like we aren't necessarily doing a good job knowing how to structure the environment that we would be most optimized for, largely because we have a lot of neurobiological, I would say, proclivities or weaknesses that make us susceptible to maladaptive behavior. With all of that being said, do you see a way in which we could undermine this process? Is it possible that our ability to steer our own complexity actually could lead to something like sufficiently disastrous like socioeconomic divides that we basically revolt or collapse, or that we build a nuclear weapon that we use to kill each other? Like you said, it's not an inexorable guarantee that we push forward. And is there some way in which maybe the steering could be problematic for our movement towards greater and greater complexity?
Yeah, so,
I know it was a lot.
Yeah,
but
no. This
that.
is great because there's nuance there that I need to articulate, because I am saying the process is inexorable, but it doesn't happen as this linear progression. The reason it's inexorable is because we do exactly what you said. We completely make mistakes. We injure the superorganism because, for example, this worldview that I'm pushing for basically was the worldview associated with the Enlightenment era and the modern era. So, and one philosopher that had a lot to do with that was Hegel, the German idealist Hegel. But he and a couple of his contemporaries like Schelling, they had this idea that nature was evolving and that human history represented the struggle of the universe to become self-aware, and it was doing it through humanity. But it is a struggle. So there's constant conflict, and it's really due to this dialectical dynamic, this kind of dual tension between order and disorder. And through that struggle, you get this phenomenon of adaptive complexity that's always progressing because it's always having to solve these existential challenges. So when people understood a superficial version of this, there was just this pro-progress mentality. That's this kind of pro-growth mentality that you see with movements like the effective acceleration EAC movement, and maybe with the effective altruism movement. You have that, and they're really for technology and progress. And then you have, opposed to that, people who are for sustainability and actually like degrowth. And so what we start to understand with this new version of the narrative, where like in the 1800s and 1900s, there was just this idea like, let's create more industry. Who cares about the environment? We are the kind of superior species, and we should be pushing for progress all the time, and that's sort of what nature wants, wants humans to keep progressing technologically. But in this picture, the biosphere is the intelligent organism that's important. We're just a component of that, and we are the most complex, sophisticated species of that superorganism. You could think of us as like a cell type. We're kind of like the neurons in the global superorganism that's the biosphere, the integrated network of humans connected by the internet and other communication technology like phones and TV. We basically form a global brain. But if we're living in a way that injures the biosphere, because everything is this part of this interdependent system where we mentioned that we need bacteria, we need bees, we need all of the species in the food chain. And we can afford to lose some sometimes. I mean, that's going to happen. But overall, you want to keep the entire system that's the biosphere in this healthy, dynamic equilibrium. So when we understand that, then we start to self-regulate. And then we start to care more about the environment because we understand it's part of us. It's basically like an extension of us. The whole living network is one integrated network. So the thing is, nature forces us back on the direct path whenever we veer from it. So we start, technological progress is happening too fast. We start seeing the consequences of those externalities. We start seeing holes in the ozone layer. We start seeing things that become basically like checks for us, like these red flags pop up, and we go, oh, we shouldn't do that. We're not living in the right way. We're not living in this way that's in harmony with nature. So we do have to always be aligning ourselves with something like the Tao from Taoism. And I like to think of it also when I was watching Rogue One, one of the newer Star Wars movies. They talk about the Force, and there's this one character, and he's like running through the battlefield, but he's blind, and he's just saying like the Force is with me or something, but it like kind of guides him like to safety. And I think about nature having kind of this teleological force that's emergent, but it's basically this tendency towards higher organization that we need to align ourselves with. And you don't really understand how you're supposed to do that until you see this paradigm of a self-organizing universe where you have this network of agents that are all part of this interconnected system that represent this island of knowledge where the universe has started to model itself, and that intelligence is expanding and starting to subsume the whole universe. So we haven't really talked about the far future. Like when I'm saying the universe is waking up, I don't mean it just gives rise to life. I'm saying something way more radical and more controversial, and that's that this network of intelligent agents is going to spread through the universe to where you have basically a cosmic scale network of intelligent agents that represent this cosmic scale distributed intelligence. And
is this
Is this something like the new sphere,
So
like from Chardin?
yes, so Teilhard de Chardin, or Chardin.
Chardin.
I've been people have been.
I feel like I
Yeah.
always mess it up. Or
I
pick
know.
different ways.
I always said Teilhard de Chardin because that's how it's spelled, but fancier people have been trying to get me to say it the French way. But yeah, Chardin. Let's just say Chardin. He will. So yeah, he's an important figure. People should look him up if they haven't heard of him. He was a Jesuit priest and a paleontologist and an evolutionary theorist, and he had this idea that evolution was progressive and it was leading to something higher. And the noosphere basically represented the concept that I mentioned earlier of the global brain. So the noosphere is basically where you have the biosphere, is this layer on top of the earth that's the living layer, that the noosphere represents a sort of cognitive layer, a layer of thought, and that humanity, being connected by communication technology, was creating this noosphere, and we're sort of nodes in this larger computational network. So the idea basically foresaw the emergence of the internet before we had any concept for that. So you see the predictive power of this theory. If you have this view of progressive evolution and you see evolution as representing this larger goal-directed process where intelligent agents are emerging and multiplying, but not just that, coming together to make this sort of uber agent or superorganism, then that gives you a clear view of the future. And so it allowed Teilhard de Chardin to predict something like the internet. And what I'm saying is that the noosphere is just the beginning. The noosphere is a seed for an intelligent network that is basically the noosphere expanding to be the size of the universe someday. And that this happens inevitably because life is this phenomenon called adaptive complexity that's always learning from its problems. It's always, and nature's always posing greater challenges, which forces that system to explore the space of possible designs. But what's teleological about this process, what makes it seem like there's some purpose and some inexorable quality, is that life always finds the solutions. Like so far, we can see progress happening at this accelerating rate that Ray Kurzweil has shown with his law of accelerating returns. So it does seem to be something that is this predictable trajectory for the universe, and you can't kill life. It's basically everything you throw at it, it gets better from that. It's like a chess playing program where it starts off just being terrible, and you start letting it play human players, but it starts encoding the patterns in every loss,
right,
and soon it becomes unbeatable.
Like the immune system, like the more we expose it with a vaccine to the thing we're trying to train it to fight, because it gets better the more it struggles to deal with these things.
Exactly. The same idea. So what might sound like a mystical view on the surface, where I'm saying like life is destined to succeed, when you have this understanding of this kind of computational universe, and that life is this computational system that's modeling the world, and it's basically a system that's an AI in the sense that it's looking for solutions to the existential problem of survival, and it's encoding all of these solutions in memory and using those in the future, then you start to see why there's this inevitable trend toward greater complexity and technological progress.
Yeah, because oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So like you would say maybe with, let's say, our increasing usage of electronics and satellites and all of this stuff, let's say something like a solar flare was to happen. So one might argue that, yes, we're becoming more complex, more advanced, but it's fragile and not very robust. But what you might say is, yes, well, let's say something tragic happened to wipe out our telecommunication system or whatnot. We would build a better model for the next iteration so that we were more resilient or robust against something like that happening. So even if we are let's say, building a teetering tower, we refortify the tower every time some of it topples over. We build more and more resilience to that because each time something like that might happen, we're strengthening our system to be able to handle that.
Yeah, so it's not just that we can rebuild and that gives us another chance. It's that this is the formula for getting good at anything. You're constantly learning about new problems, rebuilding, finding new design plans that are more robust and resilient to these problems. And it's specifically the fact that shit's always hitting the fan that makes this process work. And so you could imagine, you know, you could consider that we could be in a strange place in the universe where we get hit by all of these problems. Like, let's say there's just happens to be like a massive amount of asteroids to where it's like constantly bombarding the planet and sets intelligent life back so far that it takes so long to recover that it goes beyond the lifespan of our star. So
Right.
I don't see that happening. Like, so far there's been no setbacks that have really stopped this trend. But you could imagine that if the network of life is this kind of statistical learning machine, that even if there is a place where life is, where they happen to be that unlucky, there's enough life-bearing planets that will produce intelligence to where this is inevitable anyway. So I'm not necessarily saying that life on Earth is 100% going to succeed, but it seems that the process is resilient, like so resilient to these setbacks that it might be the case that you can't stop life wherever it emerges. And that's pretty much what they argued in this book called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle by these physicists John Barrow and Frank Tipler. That was in the 80s. But Ray Kurzweil seems to believe this. And he doesn't think life is elsewhere, from what I've what I've read from him, unless he's changed his position. He thinks that this process is going to be inevitable, even though it seems that, in his opinion, that there might not be life elsewhere. So it's a super resilient.
Do you think that there's life elsewhere?
I do, and I think, but immediately when you say that, you know, people are going to ask about the Fermi paradox. I think, so for life to emerge, you need stars and planets to form. So life has to happen according to a certain timeline. And the stars basically create the higher elements that's needed for life and technology. So there's a timeline that's necessary for the emergence of life and for the emergence of intelligent life. So I think it may be happening in different places in the universe. Because from what we understand now of origin of life research, and a lot of this is a big part of my last book, The Romance of Reality, part 1, that the emergence of life on Earth was inevitable given the conditions that were present. And so people like Carl Sagan seem to believe that, and a lot of new work coming out of the field of non-equilibrium thermodynamics seems to suggest that where the conditions are right, life emerges inevitably. And life emerged not long after the Earth formed. Basically, as soon as conditions became friendly for life, it popped up. So it does seem to be this inevitable emergence where the conditions are right. And I'm arguing that the trajectory toward an intelligent, self-aware species is also something that's inevitable, because there's always going to be an opportunity for a species that can map or model more states of the world. And when you get to that point, then you basically see that this process and this phenomenon of adaptive complexity is so resilient that expanding throughout the universe seems to be an inevitability. And if you get self-improving intelligences like humans who can use technology and nanotechnology, for example, to constantly repair cellular damage and to augment themselves in ways that can increase their cognition or, just basically make death a thing of the past, then there's no stopping this process. Once you get to what Ray Kurzweil calls the technological singularity, it seems like you can't stop life. So AI-powered life, AI-augmented life. So I don't think AI is going to be the thing that replaces us. I think it's going to be the thing that allows us to live forever, basically, and expand through the universe. And when you start looking into these things and you start thinking about them as practical problems, they do seem solvable. If you look into like Aubrey de Grey's work with life extension and stuff, it might take a while, but it seems like there are no limits to life. And a lot of what we've been taught about the second law of thermodynamics and life has to end at some point, it's starting to seem like all of that was based on a lot of misunderstandings, and that basically there seems to be no limit to the knowledge creation process. And that would make sense if the self-organizing universe is something that is becoming self-aware, if it was always the trajectory, if it was sort of predetermined. But it gets tricky because there's randomness in the universe too, and that's a big part of how this process works. So it's not a deterministic model in the old sense where everything's perfectly determined, but it does seem to be this self-organizing system where it's always learning, it's learning through life, and that there is this kind of global determinism. There's this predetermined trajectory. We could see the universe moving towards an attractor, which is a maximally complex and organized state, this omega point. Teilhard de Chardin also had that concept in addition to the noosphere. So when you see that picture, then all of the kind of weirdness about, okay, you're saying life's going to continue and spread through the universe. It was like, oh, this is just what a self-organizing universe looks like. The universe is a complex adaptive system. And when you use that language, suddenly it doesn't seem as mystical, but I'm really saying it's an organism. It's something like a developing agent that will someday be a fully integrated, harmonious entity and maybe have a cosmic consciousness of its own. Then you see why you see all of these trends that Ray Kurzweil has kind of mapped out, and other people have showed this argument towards higher complexity. And a lot of the reason that most people think that this idea has been debunked is because there was just a massive cultural backlash against it because of the mindset in the 1800s and 1900s. This idea of progress that, I said Hegel was a big person with this, but Kant as well. There were basically the Enlightenment era was just kind of like, hey, science and technology can take us anywhere we want. And that was used to justify like colonialism. The Nazis tried to use this philosophy, citing people like Hegel and people like Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer was an evolutionary theorist. He was a contemporary of Darwin. He was more famous than Darwin in his time, and he had this idea that everything was evolving towards higher complexity through this process of basically the universe creating these structures, diversifying, but also then integrating those structures into this integrated network. So the idea was said to be debunked, this myth of progress, because it was basically a giant PC movement against it in the 20th century. And a lot of people don't know that. And even a lot of the scientists who wrote about it, you read evolutionary theorists, they don't even know why they're making that argument so strongly. They're like, well, there's evolution isn't progressive. Like, they're repeating things said by people like Stephen Jay Gould without knowing that Stephen Jay Gould had a very strong ideological reason for opposing the progress narrative. And it had a lot to do with colonialism and Nazis. And basically, it's just a wild story. But the postmodern movement was also, one of their big goals was killing this idea. They thought that these grand narratives or these meta narratives of like progress, continual progress, inexorable progress, were tools of oppression. And that became the narrative in academia. And so this idea that I'm saying, which is like this massive idea, people might like say, oh, well, if that's true, then how come we haven't heard anything about it? Why do we hear that life is doomed because of the second law of thermodynamics? The universe is moving towards more disorder. It's really because some of those laws had implications that kind of implied that, if not understood correctly. But it was more of a cultural thing. It was more of a movement of people that were concerned that this idea could be misused again.
It also seems like it was reductionism took hold for pragmatic reasons, whereas like complexity, the idea that you're speaking to here is one that's very deeply rooted in complexity science, and that is much harder to understand if you're a nascent species, right? If you don't have the knowledge to track all of the variables like we are increasingly capable of with like informational computational modeling, something like a complexity theory would seem mystical, like in an Arthur C. Clarke kind of way, right? It's sufficiently advanced to be magical. So reductionism was, easy to use.
Yeah. So when the method of science was to break things down into their smaller parts, and we made a lot of progress with that. We started to understand that, living things were made of molecules. We started to understand, we developed molecular biology. And on the physics side, we were looking for smaller and smaller particles. And that led to theories like quantum mechanics that allowed us to create like electronics and information technology. And so we didn't have a mature science of complexity until the second half of the 20th century. And now I think, people are applying different types of information theory and different types of physics, like statistical mechanics, to understand life, to biology. And we're really starting to understand complexity plus information. We're getting this kind of computational view and understanding what life is better, understanding like organisms and agency. And so you're right there. But there was definitely an intellectual movement that made this idea taboo after it was so massive, from people like Herbert Spencer and Hegel and Teilhard de Chardin. And I think a lot of people don't know about that. I didn't know the extent of it so much until I started reading about it from this postmodern perspective. I knew the evolutionary theorists were against it, like Stephen Jay Gould, I mentioned him, Ernst Mayr is another. Right. I thought they were against it mostly because they were pushing back against Teilhard de Chardin, who had this kind of Christian view of the process, which I think is really cool because it wasn't really Christian at all. It was just a secularized Christianity where he kind of mapped on the ideas from Christianity to this idea of progressive evolution, and the omega point represented like the cosmic Christ.
Right.
Which I think is really neat and provides like an opportunity for like a modern Christianity. But it wasn't just that. It was also the postmodernists were pushing back against grand narratives because it wasn't just colonialism, but it was also apparently all of this like industrial growth, all of these things that were like, you saw harm being done to the environment was really being promoted with this ideology of progress in mind. Like we just need to build. And it's interesting because with this, effective altruism movement and the EAC movement, and then the people who are against it that want us to slow everything down, you see that same dialectic playing out, that same debate. And I think we need to get past the debate. We need to understand that we always need to progress. And we have a timeline. We have to get off the planet before we exhaust all the resources. We definitely have to get off of it before the sun explodes in 5 billion years. So actually humans are the stewards of this self-organization process. We are the only chance for life to get off the earth. Lower organisms aren't going to be able to do that. Only technologically advanced intelligences are capable of allowing consciousness to persist once the stars exhaust all of their gas and then explode. I mean, it's not just that it's going to run out of fuel. It's going to give this giant supernova explosion.
We run out of fuel at the same time.
We're going to get
and then
become toast.
Explode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's here's the interesting thing, though. It's all part of this process. It is an inexorable process, and it is unconscious, but built into the process is that organisms will become self-aware. So it's our self-awareness that allows us to understand the universe and understand these basically like thermodynamic game clocks that push us and people like Elon Musk to say, hey, we got to get off the planet. And so we're already trying to do that right now, even though there's no immediate threat. At least, it's not like going to be tomorrow or this year. And, there are a lot of problems in the world, too. It's hard to figure out how to balance that. There are, tons of people starved around the world. Looks like World War III is going to break out, but we still need to be thinking long term at the same time. So it's a big question. It's like how to balance those, how to prioritize. And sometimes we do need to slow growth because there are these limits until we switch paradigms. Until we can crack the secret of nuclear fusion, for example, and other forms of clean energy and sustainable ways of living and progressing, we might have to slow. So when you get this kind of meta picture, then you start to see hey, we got to get past all of these debates, but we actually have to look at them, look at each side and go, okay, there's good things for this side. And then you synthesize from that dialectic, from those opposing viewpoints, you synthesize a greater viewpoint that is this evolutionary process in work. It takes the best elements of both, but I think we do have to recognize we can't be midway on the idea that there's this progressive process. We do have to realize that we're part of a cosmic process, and we actually have a cosmic responsibility because as the only self-aware agents on Earth, we're the only things that can keep life going.
Yeah, with that EAC stuff and kind of the debate, Guillaume Verdon and Connor Leahy had their debate not long ago, kind of on this it's quite good. I think you would really appreciate it, but they're kind of touching on this idea that I would say we're approaching something like a singularity, something like a moment where we might be getting to that point you talked about where, all rules fall away and we really do start to have this amazing power to model the world and start fighting off some of these previously foregone conclusions like death and things like that. But as we approach that, as we get closer to that point, I feel like things get more and more precarious, right? The closer you get to that moment, the more unstable the system becomes before it stabilizes, right? As we approach that, where do you feel like we are on that? Should we take the EAC approach and go full force forward and just say survival of the fittest, whatever meme and model works best will push us forward and get us there? Or is there something to be said for if we are trying to find the edge of chaos where criticality works, right? If we are trying to be on the Tao, as you mentioned earlier, where we have a good balance of disorder and order, is there something to be said for the Connor Leahys and the Doomer types who say, whoa, there's something to be said for a precautionary principle here. Maybe we should consider slowing down or doing this in a more delicate way and not going full force forward because you're doing a thing that would take us into full chaos. So maybe we should step back towards a balance.
So this really has to be articulated, and those debates are good preliminary debates, but yeah, you have to understand that the solution is going to come from looking at both sides, and then here's the problem with that. The people who want to progress so fast aren't the people that are right about how to make progress happen at the fastest rate possible. Because the faster you go, just like you said, it does lead to chaos. It does lead to damaging the system, the superorganism. It leads to harming the environment, which is harming the intelligent network. So this sounds kind of like Taoist or maybe Confucianist, but like, yeah, the statement to go fast, we must go slow, sometimes at least.
Right.
So,
or slower. At least.
So if and that should be obvious too. So it's like the people are saying like grow, I go fast. It's like, if you want to go fast, like don't do that. Like don't go too fast. If you want to go at the best rate possible, think about, I think we need to do something that I've seen referred to as like future forecasting. I had a friend that was in design school. It's like at Parsons in New York. It seemed like to be a pretty abstract curriculum, and they had courses on like emergence and complexity. But we need to map out like the different possible trajectories. For example, we need to look at like, are we headed towards World War III? If this nation does this, then what's going to happen? If this nation does this, what's going to happen? If we do this with technology, if we go all in on, if we don't if we don't transition to more sustainable energies, we just, we keep using like burning coal and using oil. Like if we do it for the next 20 years, what's going to happen? So we need to create computer models of all these things, and we need to try to find like our blind spots. But so what that entails is having the debates just like the one you said, where we have the progress people and then the doomer people. But what I'm trying to say that's like so hard to articulate is like the pro-growth people, they're not really the progress people, because they're going to mess things up if they do it their way. The doomer people, some of them don't want to progress at all. Some of them might want to live like indigenous people, which maybe could be good for like a certain amount of time, but it's not going to work forever, and eventually life will end. Like I said, we have that problem with our star dying. Like we have to progress to continue consciousness and creativity and love, all these great things that exist because of consciousness. We have to progress technologically to ensure that those things keep going. But so those people are wrong too. But if there's people on the doomer side that are just saying, hey guys, we want to progress too, but you can't do it that way, you have to go slow sometimes, then they're the right people. So the progress people have to be people who look at the pro-growth people and the doomer people and go, this is right on this side, this is right on this side, and this is going to give you the optimal rate of progress. You people who think you're all about progress, you've got it all wrong, because you're actually going to fuck the whole system up, and you're also going to give this whole movement a bad name. Like you're going to wreck it in so many ways because you think you just go like 100%.
Another misreading of the second law.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah, and that's a whole other topic, because we don't
need to go down there, but it seems like the opposite problem, right? A lot of people think everything's going to crash and collapse and we're going to run out of energy and not become more complex, but some people misread it maybe the other direction and say, oh, we should just do all complexity at all costs in any given moment and not have any kind of thought in terms of how the complexity is being achieved.
Which is so ironic, because that is what causes the collapse, so
yes.
You have to have this weird meta picture where you don't just think like in this kind of one-dimensional way where you're like, we gotta go, because doing that and progressing actually entails taking all of these precautions, not going so fast, because we don't know what we're doing. We don't fully understand the world enough yet to know the repercussions of what we're doing. So we need to go fast. So it's like, it's very hard to take a position on this, like that. And I'm still trying to figure out how to explain it, because in a way I'm saying we need to go as fast as possible, but I'm also saying going as fast as possible means also slowing down sometimes.
Right.
And not going fast as possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. I want to kind of bring that to head in a last question or so here. I do realize we're over time. I just want to check with you really quick. Are you good for a little bit more?
It's fun.
Okay, yeah. Well, with that being said, like I think we've kind of danced around it, but you've talked about your like meta religion around this, right? And we've been using words like telos, and we've been referencing a Jesuit priest. What is the meta narrative maybe that you think we could bring to a head to help steer this? And does this, I would say, description of the universe provide us with prescriptions? Can we say that this tendency of the universe as a non-conscious system tells us what we should do as entities that are conscious?
Yeah, I think this is the first kind of theory of everything that is prescriptive. It tells us what to do because it gives, it creates a purpose for intelligent life in this process, and it gives us a cosmic responsibility. We are the drivers of the complexification process as self-aware agents.
Kind of like stewards of the trajectory.
Yeah, and we need to see ourselves as that way. And once we do, then the world just becomes super psychedelic and weird. And you're like, wow, I'm part of this meaningful thing where nature's waking up through me, and it's at the beginning of this process, and it's headed towards this omega point that we can't fully grasp, but it seems to be an inexorable trajectory towards that. And so to me, that's super spiritual. And then you can look at the history of philosophy and theology, and really religion was just kind of existential philosophy before we had the scientific method, especially a lot of Eastern religions, because Eastern religion, a lot of those stories were trying to explain and make metaphors for cosmic processes, and Hegel looked at it this way. He understood Christianity through this cosmic evolutionary progressive evolution lens, where he saw the story, the Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as basically the Father was this undifferentiated state of the absolute, and the Son was basically humanity. So it's nature becoming self-aware, but it's not yet what it's going to be in the future. It's not yet this like state of like ultimate harmony and something like perfection that is going to exist at the omega point. He didn't have a name for the omega point. He kind of thought that just understanding this philosophy was kind of the culmination of the process. So we really need Teilhard de Chardin for understanding what would be analogous to the Holy Spirit. But that concept of a Trinity gives you this idea of nature being this undifferentiated thing that's then waking up through self-aware agents. And then at some point, at the culmination of this evolutionary process, it becomes one unified self-aware entity. So for me, that's super spiritual, and it doesn't require believing any of the superstitious things in religion. And when you look into these different religions more, I mentioned Hinduism, but you have these different concepts. Like they have their holy trinity, the Trimurti, which is Brahma. So Brahman is everything, but he's also manifested as this Trimurti, which is really how nature is. Everything's part of this interconnected system, but you have Brahma the creator, Shiva the destroyer, and then Vishnu the preserver. And basically this maps onto the story I've been explaining in this podcast, because Brahma the creator is this tendency towards order that creates structure and design in nature. Shiva is this second law of thermodynamics, this tendency towards disorder. And through that interplay, you get adaptive complexity, you get life, and that's Vishnu the preserver. And then life it has the responsibility of sustaining that order. So life is Vishnu, the preserver, and Vishnu has to look at the processes of Brahma. We have to understand the evolutionary process and the interaction with this tendency towards disorder of Shiva. So I think that basically you can create a meta religion by mapping the stories of the different religions onto this philosophy of a self-organizing universe, which Hegel and Teilhard de Chardin did with Christianity, but they used different concepts, like the Omega Point wasn't part of Christianity, and this dialectical dynamic and the absolute that Hegel had these concepts for, you don't find them in Christianity, but you find them in Eastern religion. And so the story of the self-organizing universe is basically the story of the becoming of Brahman. And Brahman goes from being this unconscious reality that doesn't have much diversity or variety or interestingness into this Omega Point. So at that point, Brahma becomes Christ. And it's really interesting because the evolutionary process seems to have a moral arc too. The agents seem to be becoming more moral as they become more intelligent and evolve. So it's super spiritual for me.
Can I steel man that with a question for you? Are you saying to some extent that if we look at all of these of the world's religions, that we might see a template almost that speaks to this telos, and that maybe they could all be unified by showing them how they all kind of fit into this larger narrative? Is that kind of...
I think it pops out when you see this, the cosmic evolutionary story, and then you go back and you look at the different religions, you can piece that together pretty quickly. And
what's it mean for that to be spiritual? Like what's that word mean in your mind?
So it means, rather than being an insignificant system, an insignificant organism in this meaningless and purposeless universe, because you could imagine a universe where it only generates the complexity that we see today, and then life just hits a barrier, and then it can't progress, it can never get off the planet, and then it's doomed. And then, 500 years ago, we had no reason to think that we could continuously live up to all of these challenges. And we didn't really discuss the second law of thermodynamics, but there's reason to think that this process doesn't need to end. For some people, it might just be like a non-starter, the whole argument, until you address that. I have an article for Noema called "Life Need Not Ever End" that David Deutsch shared. David Deutsch also talks about this concept. But when you see this story, and you're a part of it, and you have a cosmic responsibility to continue life, seeing that the process depends on you changes everything. I mean, if you really take this to heart and you're like, wow, this is what nature is. It's something that's always in this process of becoming, of developing into something higher, then the world is filled with meaning, and the future is an unimaginably interesting place, because it's not just this maximally complex state. We're creating all of these new kinds of experiences. Humans are focused on, not just progressing and expanding outward. We're really going inward. We create film and art and music and literature. And so, for example, music, if you see people at a concert and they're all like moving together, or people in a nightclub and they're in this kind of trance-like state, I think that's the best kind of representation of like the superorganism in this evolutionary process. You start to see the emergence of spirit. So you have
I was gonna say,
you have,
that's very emergent behavior, like a flock of birds, like at a concert.
So you have matter, life, consciousness, and culture, and then I think spirit. Teilhard de Chardin said spirit was the next emergence. It's hard to know what that means exactly, but I think with something like a concert, you could imagine in the newest Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, when they team up with their daughters, there I think there's a concert that kind of saves the world and brings world peace. But I could see a future society where there are like world concerts and things like that happening. Really, that's what's happening is our causal power is increasing, and we're able to communicate to where, for example, if there was an existential threat, we could get everybody on Earth, almost, not everybody, but most people to work on it at the same time if we really, really needed to. Where a couple hundred years ago, there'd be just no way to relay the message if it was something immediate.
It also seems like, for me, I mean, this is something I am a fond believer in many of the ideas that you've talked about here. I mean, for me, it's something that holds true in a lot of my interest and my, I guess, current curiosities and things that I would promote. And one of the things that you're alluding to here that I think is nice about it is, and that I've been attracted to about it, is it kind of, if like Nietzsche said, we killed God, to me, this kind of reawakens him in a sense, right? Because there's a lot of nihilism that says, okay, these, I think as Sam Harris maybe puts it, these dead desert religions, these dead desert cults no longer serve us, right? Like the Christian stuff, the ideas that came from 2,000 years ago don't seem to be modeling or giving us the meaning that we had hoped for. But if you suddenly say, but guess what? You're a steward of complexity moving the universe towards a better place. Suddenly you're like, oh shit, there's still something here. Like there's still a telos. There's something imbued in the system that gives it meaning, that doesn't require that I adopt this pre-packaged set of beliefs and answers, but instead I kind of get to find the answers myself on this journey of complexification.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I would love to see Sam Harris convinced by this argument, because it's a completely different world. I mean, he wants to get there with, he has the Waking Up app and he's really into spirituality, but he seems to have this view. I know he talks about Eastern. I've been listening to the Alan Watts talks that are offered through the app. But the one thing that I think Hinduism got wrong is it thinks that ultimately, Brahma is the creator, then there's Vishnu, the preserver, but ultimately the world ends with the destruction by Shiva, and then it maybe repeats in another cycle. But it's cyclic. There's this eternal recurrence where this paradigm of recursive emergence really is this process of eternal recursive emergence. So reality is just constantly, it's going through these cycles, but the cycles are always building on each other, making something grander. So I think reality is like a poem that's always getting more interesting, or a song. It's like Bohemian Rhapsody, the way it just seems to go on forever. It's like 10 minutes long and it like keeps getting better and better. So you can imagine a song where you have like verse, chorus, but the next time the verse comes around, it's more intricate. And the next time the chorus comes around, and there will be, these bridges where maybe things get quiet for a bit. Like it would be boring if it was always getting better and better and better with, right. So you need the wild ride and the ups and downs. But I think this is a story of continual complexification that is basically like a never-ending story. And to me, that's super spiritual. For some people, they want to know, like, well, is there an afterlife, something like that? And I don't know what this says about that, but I know people like Bernardo Kastrup haven't completely ruled that out. I also saw an exchange I was part of on Twitter with Jim Rutt and AI researcher Josha Bach, and Josha was kind of telling Jim Rutt, who was more of an atheist, like not to rule this out. But if there is this omega point and everything in the universe forms this integrated computational system, like if we die and we're part of that, if we're part of this collective consciousness, this cosmic consciousness, have we really died? Is that some sort of afterlife? Maybe. Especially if we're just a pattern or a model that can be transmitted to another medium in some regard. Exactly. I guess Bernardo.
Well, I feel like
We'd have to ask Bernardo.
Yeah, I
Castro
feel like
what he thinks about
rebirth.
that, yeah.
I have actually. It was an interesting conversation. Well, with that being said, since we've touched on, came all the way to creating God basically and reincarnating ourselves, I feel like that's a good place to bring it to a close. So I don't run you all afternoon here. But any closing thoughts, man? Anything that we might not have touched on? I think we purposely try to avoid entropy and some other things to not get too far in the weeds and maybe dance through a few topics. But is there something that you would like to maybe bring it all together with, or a closing thought?
Well, just about that entropy point. If you look at the cosmic inflation theory, now it's basically eternal inflation, and that doesn't see life as ending. It sees life as ending in this universe, but the universe is always, there's a multiverse, so new universes are always being created and life exists in those, and that process goes on forever, because with current thinking in physics, basically you can create energy forever. A lot of people think first law says conservation of energy can't be created or destroyed, and the second law says the useful energy is always being used up, turned in entropy. Entropy is a measure of energy unavailable for work. But basically, you can continuously create more and more energy, and you have this usable energy, and then that's called positive energy. And then there's negative energy, that's the energy of the gravitational force that's created with that new mass. And all matter can be used as energy because of E equals mc squared. So, and right now, the universe, you can look in Shaw Carroll's blog, there's an entry about a new paper showing that dark energy is continuously being created. So it's not the fact that the energy supply will be exhausted. So yeah, that Noema article I mentioned, where you can also look into the work of physicist David Laser, that showed that basically the universe can continuously create information forever because the maximum possible entropy is always growing, and there's not like any hard limit, it seems. So yeah, check out my Substack. I've written about this meta-religion idea. I'm about to make a post soon that tries to take different Eastern and Western religions and map it onto this story of self-organization, and also tries to frame reality as a game where self-aware agents are trying to wake up the universe. And I think, if we kind of internalize this paradigm, then we see ourselves as part of that process, and we have this responsibility to wake up the universe. So yeah, that's all. I think it's a pretty trippy story that I'd like to see other people follow to its conclusions. I mean, this is just this is the beginning of it. If this picture of the evolution of the universe is accurate, then like way crazier stuff is going to come out of it than what I've said here.